let's just start broad brush. Let's assume the audience knows very little about Russia and Ukraine, because most people don't pay that much attention. It's like, what are they doing? They're saber rattling again. Our president misstepped and said something stupid again. Okay, are we going to Russia? Are we going to war with Russia or not? Probably not. But there is a lot to watch and follow. So let's just start with this. Why is Russia on Ukraine's border right now? Why does it have 100,000 troops sitting there in a threatening way and has captured the attention of the world?
I think really the basic answer is that they want to break up NATO. They don't like NATO, which, as you know, was literally created and designed to keep Russia from entering into Europe and to not rolling over Eastern Europe. And so what's been happening under the Trump administration is that we've been strengthening NATO. You know, it's so crazy, Megyn, because the narrative from the media was that Donald Trump was undermining NATO. And I would really argue, and I could go toe to toe with anyone to say, if you care about an organization that is adrift, do you ignore it and let it be adrift, or do you actually go in, talk about the problems and try to fix it? Let's give the analogy of a marriage. If your marriage is not going well, do you try to fix it, or do you ignore it and eventually say, you know what, this is over? I actually believe that we're in that relationship right now with the UN, for instance. It's not going well. It's wasting money. We're ignoring it. That's not good. It's eventually going to come to the point where we say it's useless. But with NATO, Donald Trump was annoyed that NATO was adrift. And so he engaged. He tried to get members to do more. I think the Russians have seen under Donald Trump more money going into NATO, us talking about reforming NATO. Clearly, there's conversations about who should become NATO. And that has become a NATO member. And that has been scaring the Russians. The Russians then see Joe Biden take over. They see, and I think this is an incredibly important point, a disastrous Afghanistan pullout, which signaled to the world that we were really in terrible leadership positions here in the United States. We had a weak leadership team at the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House, the NSC. And so, like Putin did under the Obama-Biden regime, when he grabbed parts of the Ukraine, this area called Crimea, just went in and grabbed it, and it was over quickly. By the way, he did that right after the Olympics. Now what we're seeing is the Russians saber rattling. I think that's a good description. And now they're all around the Ukraine border, threatening to take over or cause some sort of conflict, destabilization campaign inside Ukraine. That's where we are. I think it's all signaling from a weak Biden administration. There is no possible way Putin would be doing this under a Donald Trump administration.
They do not, the Russians, want Ukraine to become a part of NATO. And right now we've sort of given them a special status. It's like you're our little special friend. You're NATO adjacent, but you're not in NATO. But they really want us to say explicitly they're not in NATO and they will never be in NATO. And then they want us to make all sorts of promises about not expanding NATO further and not having certain military installations or certain weapons around Russia or, in these European countries. They basically asked for everything. Putin, in response to our demands of, what are you looking for, has given us the kitchen sink of Russia's wish list. And we're basically saying, yeah, you're not getting all of that. But is it all about the fact that Ukraine had been getting closer and closer to Western countries and getting more and more NATO adjacent than it even had been, and Putin's fear? Because he sees NATO as really an extension. He sees Ukraine as an extension of Russia. And is this really about just stopping at bottom Ukraine from becoming part of NATO?
Well, first of all, I have to say, can I start using NATO adjacent? And do I have to credit you? Because that is brilliant. I love
Carte
that.
blanche.
Okay. I think it's all about NATO's strength. The Russians have always hated NATO, although they do have an office there and in Brussels and trying to coordinate, because we want to make sure that we don't just all of a sudden miscommunicate and end up in war. So they've had an office there. They've closed the office. Now they're kind of working, but not really working. and talking. So it's definitely a problem. I think it is all about NATO membership. Certainly, we have other countries that have talked about joining NATO, who are NATO adjacent, and they've wanted to move into the status, like Finland. And suddenly there is an uproar from the Russians. They don't want to see this. They certainly don't like their former satellite countries or areas becoming closer to NATO. They don't like NATO on their doorstep. And so I do believe that this is a signal and a negotiations tactic to say, look what we can do if you start talking more about putting Ukraine into NATO.
Now, we have said apparently that that's a non-starter. We've repeatedly said that any guarantees that Ukraine will never be a part of NATO is a non-starter, not negotiable. And the Russians are saying, too bad. That's our core demand. They also want, here's a list of what the Kremlin had reportedly, apparently Putin had a conversation with Macron of France and said, I'm mad because so far no one's taking account of key Russian concerns like the one we just discussed, Ukraine. Also, we just don't want NATO expansion at all. And we want the non-deployment of strike weapons systems near Russian borders. And we want NATO to return its military potential and infrastructure in Europe to positions existing in 1997. Again, we've called all of those things non-starters. But can you explain points 2 and 3? Non-deployment of strike weapon systems near Russian borders, and then returning NATO's military potential and infrastructure back to what it was in 97.
So first of all, let's start from the fact that I'm going to say something that immediately everybody's going to jump on and say, oh my God, he's pro-Putin. This is a terrible guy. We don't want to stick our finger in the eye of Russia or Putin. That shouldn't be our goal. And I think it was so brilliant when Donald Trump would say, we're going to put tough sanctions, we're going to try to change the behavior, we're going to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but I want to get along with Russia. And the left would go crazy to say, why are you saying that? And I think that it's important to say upfront, especially as a diplomat. I've been at the State Department for 11 years. We don't want to not get along with any country. We should look to try to find ways, but we should have absolutes. So let me start by saying that. But I do believe that the demands of Russia to not put any hardware, and what they're really saying is, don't move strike force capability, don't move mobile missile launchers, don't move people, don't make it look like you're threatening us on our borders. So don't move it closer to us through your NATO countries or through countries in Central or Eastern Europe. And, the Russian point of view is don't threaten us by moving weaponry closer to us. I get it. But our point of view is you don't tell us what to do. We're America. And when you start threatening people, we have to react. So it is a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing. We want to make sure that we don't take anything off the table. That's important in negotiations. But I think we've had terrible negotiators because we should be able to sit across the table and say, look, we don't want war. Our people are tired of war. We're bringing home troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, now Biden is adding troops in Syria. Right. So he is trying to start wars. But under Trump, we certainly didn't. And I think that it's really important when we boil this down that the audience understands we did not have this problem when Donald Trump was saying we have sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a huge, not only moneymaker for Russia, but it is a pipeline of influence into Europe. And when we had sanctions and when we talked about shutting down that pipeline, it never came online. And technically, it's still not online. We could do the diplomatic thing and say we're shutting down this pipeline, and I think Russian behavior would change. But this would have never happened if we had a president who didn't back down and give a pipeline to the Germans, and immediately the Russians smell weakness. I mean, I could go on, and there's other parts of the world. Look at the Houthis and the UAE. I'm so outraged about what's going on there, Megyn. It's unbelievable. We have Abu Dhabi, a commerce hub in the Middle East, a peaceful nation, an ally. We have a lot of Americans in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. The Houthis, who were taken off the terrorist list by Joe Biden, were immediately sending rockets, launching rockets into Abu Dhabi. What is going on?
Right.
Everyone around the world is smelling weakness with Joe Biden.